We should begin where this habit actually lives, not in language, but in tension, in that familiar moment after you send a message, after you state a boundary, after you make a choice that disappoints someone, and then feel the pull to explain more. Not because your point was unclear, not because the facts were missing, but because something inside you became uncomfortable the moment you were no longer fully in control of how you were being seen. That is the moment most people misunderstand. They think they're communicating, but often they are not communicating at all. They are trying to regulate anxiety through words. You can watch it happen in real time. A simple no goes out. Then another message follows. A boundary is stated. Then it is padded, softened, justified, almost apologized for. A decision is made. Then suddenly it arrives with extra moral framing, extra context, extra effort to make sure nobody feels too much friction from it. The facts have not changed. What changed is the body. The moment the other person's reaction became uncertain, your center started to wobble and language rushed in to stabilize what felt unstable. That is why over-explaining is rarely just a habit of speech. It is a habit of self-protection. Words are being used not only to express meaning, but to reduce exposure, to make rejection less sharp, to make judgment less likely, to make misunderstanding less painful before it even happens. On the surface, this can look thoughtful, mature even, but underneath there is often a quieter truth. You are no longer speaking only to communicate. You are speaking to calm yourself. And people feel that, even when they cannot name it. They hear the sentence, yes, but they also hear the posture inside the sentence. They feel when someone is simply saying what is true, and they feel when someone is trying to keep the whole emotional atmosphere from turning against them. That difference matters more than most people realize, because once the words start carrying hidden urgency, they stop landing with the same weight. A clear position can begin to sound unsure. A strong boundary can start to feel negotiable. A simple truth can lose force because too much effort is now wrapped around it. This is why saying more often produces the opposite of what you wanted. You thought more explanation would make you look reasonable. Sometimes it makes you look unconvinced. You thought more detail would protect your image. Sometimes it reveals how badly that image needs protection. You thought one more paragraph would settle the issue. Instead, it quietly tells the other person that pressure still works on you. That if they stay cold long enough or skeptical long enough or offended long enough, they may get more from you than the truth itself. They may get your balance. And that is the deeper issue here. The pain is not always misunderstanding. The pain is loss of control. It is the shock of realizing that once your words leave you, they enter a mind you do not control. That mind has its own history, ego, wounds, loyalties, assumptions. It may shrink what you meant. It may darken it. It may turn your calm into cruelty, your distance into arrogance, your self-respect into selfishness. Most people can tolerate disagreement more than they can tolerate distortion, so they keep talking, trying to fix inside the other person what no amount of language can fully govern. That is where the exhaustion begins. Because if your peace depends on being understood correctly by everyone who matters to you, then no difficult interaction ever really ends. There is always one more sentence to add, one more angle to clarify, one more misunderstanding to preempt. You start hovering over your own words, trying to manage what they do after they leave you. And slowly, without noticing, you move from conviction to surveillance. You are no longer speaking from your ground. You are monitoring yourself in real time, adjusting for impact, editing for reception, trying to stay acceptable in someone else's eyes. Stoicism cuts through this with almost brutal simplicity. Your responsibility is your intention, your clarity, your conduct, not the final arrangement of your image inside another person's mind. You are responsible for whether what you said was honest. You are responsible for whether it was clean. You are not responsible for eliminating every possible misreading of it. The moment you take on that burden, your dignity becomes dependent on reception. And that is always dangerous, because once your inner steadiness depends on being read correctly, anyone who refuses to read you fairly gains more power over you than they deserve. You can see this most clearly with the people whose opinions still get under your skin. A stranger may misread you and irritate you for a minute, but a parent, a partner, a friend, a boss, someone whose judgment still touches an old bruise, can pull a very different response out of you. Now one sentence does not feel enough. Now the long explanation begins. Not because you became wiser, because you became less free. You need them to know you're not selfish, not cold, not disrespectful, not what their disappointment is trying to make you feel like. So the explanation grows, and with every extra line, the real struggle becomes more visible. You're not just trying to make the point clear, you are trying to restore inner safety. That is why over-explaining so often carries the energy of a request for permission, not openly, not in words anyone would admit to, but underneath, that is often what is happening. Please see this the right way. Please do not turn this into something uglier than it is. Please let me keep my decision without making me pay for it emotionally. Once that energy enters your speech, something shifts. The conversation is no longer held by truth alone. It is being shaped by your need for the other person to release you from the discomfort their reaction created. A grounded person does not do this as often, not because they never care, not because they are cold, but because they know the difference between explaining a fact and explaining their right to exist as they are. They clarify when clarity is needed. They add context when context truly matters. Then they stop. They do not keep offering language in the hope that enough verbal effort will finally produce emotional safety. They know that at some point, more explanation stops serving truth and starts serving fear. That line is everything. On one side of it is real communication. On the other is self-abandonment in a polite tone. And most people do not notice they have crossed it until they hear themselves talking too long, softening too much, giving away too much, and feeling smaller with every sentence instead of stronger. That shrinking feeling is important. It tells you the words are no longer carrying your truth cleanly. They are carrying your anxiety with it. The mature move is not to become cold, silent, or impossible to reach. It is to become more exact about why you are speaking. Are you clarifying what is true, or are you trying to control what cannot fully be controlled? Are you offering one more sentence because it adds light, or because you cannot bear the dark space where another person may leave with the wrong version of you? Those are very different motives, and they create very different presences. The person who says less is not always wiser, but the person who can remain steady after saying enough is usually stronger, because they are no longer treating every misunderstanding like an emergency. They are no longer turning every reaction into a referendum on their worth. They have learned something harder than eloquence. They have learned how to tell the truth without chasing emotional permission after it. There is another reason over-explaining weakens you, and it has less to do with private psychology than with social reality. People do not only respond to what you say, they respond to how settled you seem while saying it. A short answer from someone grounded lands differently than a long answer from someone trying to hold the interaction together by force. Even when the content is reasonable, too much explanation can make the whole thing feel unstable. Not because detail is bad, but because emotional pressure changes the texture of detail. It makes the words lean. It makes them ask for something. And other people feel that before they consciously understand why. Think about how this works in ordinary conversation. Someone says, "I can't make it." Clean, simple. Then 3 more messages arrive. Now there is context, apology, reassurance, tone management, an effort to make sure no one feels the wrong kind of disappointment. By the end, the original sentence has lost some of its strength. It no longer feels like a clear statement from someone who knows what they can and cannot do. It feels like a statement followed by an attempt to keep everyone comfortable with the statement. That is where authority starts draining out of speech. Not when you become rude, when you become over-available inside your own explanation. Calm brevity has a weight that nervous detail usually does not. Not because short sentences are automatically powerful, they are not. But when brevity comes from inner steadiness, people register it quickly. It tells them there is no hidden panic behind the words, no scramble for approval, no need to over-negotiate the right to stand where you stand. That is why people often respect the person who can answer directly and remain there, even if they do not love the answer. The steadiness itself becomes part of the message. You see this clearly at work. A manager asks if you can stay late again. You say, "I can't tonight." That could have been enough. But then you hear yourself adding, "I would. It's just been a long week, and I already moved something yesterday, and I know the team is under pressure, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way." In a few seconds, the answer changes shape. It stops sounding like a limit. It starts sounding like a limit looking for permission to exist. The same thing happens in families. You say you need space this weekend. Then comes the wounded pause. Maybe a parent says, "Wow, okay." Maybe a sibling asks why you are acting distant lately. And now, instead of holding the boundary, you begin building a case for it. You explain your stress, your schedule, your mental state, your intentions, all the ways this does not mean rejection, disrespect, or lack of love. And somehow, after saying 10 times more than you meant to say, you feel less understood than before. Why? Because the conversation was no longer really about clarity. It had become a test of whether your boundary would stay intact once guilt entered the room. This is where over-explaining becomes dangerous. It teaches people that pressure creates openings, not always consciously, not always maliciously. But people learn. They learn that if they stay cold long enough, skeptical long enough, hurt long enough, they may get more from you than the original answer. They may get access to your uncertainty. They may get your effort. They may get your balance. And that is what makes manipulation easier. Often it is not dramatic. No one needs to be a mastermind. Someone only needs to notice that your discomfort produces extra language, a disappointed tone, a hanging silence, a sentence like, "I just don't understand why you'd do that." For many people, that is enough. They rush in to repair the atmosphere. They explain more, soften more, reveal more. And once that pattern is visible, other people do not need a stronger argument. They only need to touch the right nerve. That is why it is so important to see that some questions are not real questions. They are hooks. Some confusion is not confusion. It is resistance that does not like your limit. Some requests for more clarity come long after clarity has already been given. At that point, what is being tested is no longer your ability to explain. It is your ability to stop. That stopping point is one of the clearest markers of social strength. Not aggression, not coldness, not performance. Just the ability to feel when an exchange has shifted from communication into extraction. When more words are no longer making the truth cleaner, only making you more exposed. The strongest people are often not the ones with the most brilliant explanations. They are the ones who can sense the moment explanation stops being useful and refuse to donate more of themselves to a conversation that is now feeding on their need to be understood. This is why saying less is often misread by weak people as harshness. They are used to over-access. They are used to boundaries arriving wrapped in enough softness to dissolve their discomfort. So when a clear answer comes without all the extra emotional cushioning, it can feel abrupt to them. But that does not mean it is wrong. It may only mean they expected the line to be softer than it was. A mature person does not need unlimited access to your inner process in order to respect you. They may not like your decision. They may not agree with your boundary. They may still feel disappointed, but they can recognize a clear line when they hear one. It is usually the immature, the entitled, or the emotionally intrusive who keep demanding more language after the truth has already been spoken. They do not hear your explanation as information. They hear it as proof that the line is still movable. So part of growing stronger is learning to disappoint people without rushing in to manage everything they feel about it. Not carelessly, not cruelly, just cleanly. The moment you feel that urge to over-explain, the real question is no longer, how can I make this land better? The real question is this person trying to understand me or reacting to the fact that they no longer control the exchange? A lot of people do not over-explain because they are weak communicators. They over-explain because they are terrified of being cast in the wrong moral role. They can handle disagreement better than they can handle feeling like the bad one. So the moment tension rises, they do not only defend the point, they defend their character inside the point. They rush to clarify that they did not mean harm, that they are not cold, not selfish, not unfair, not cruel, not like the kind of person who would do this carelessly, and without noticing it, they turn one difficult moment into a trial about who they are. This is where the habit becomes deeper than fear of misunderstanding. It becomes fear of mischaracterization, and that fear has enormous power over people who have built their identity around being thoughtful, kind, reliable, considerate, emotionally mature. Those qualities sound noble. Often they are. But they can also become a trap. Because once being a good person becomes something you must constantly prove in real time, you become extremely vulnerable to anyone who knows how to make you feel guilty. Now, a simple boundary is no longer just a boundary. It becomes a threat to your self-image. A refusal starts to feel like selfishness. Distance starts to feel like betrayal. Silence starts to feel like cruelty. And then the explanation begins. You can see it in very ordinary moments. You tell a friend you cannot keep having the same late-night crisis conversation every week. That is a real limit, a healthy one. But the second they go quiet, you feel the pull to explain that you still care, that you are just tired, that you have your own things going on, that this is not abandonment, that you are not trying to be harsh, that you would help if you could do it in a healthier way. Maybe some of that is true. Maybe some of it even deserves saying. But very often, the real engine underneath the explanation is simpler. You cannot bear the feeling that they may leave that conversation seeing you as less kind than you see yourself. That is why so much over-explaining has moral anxiety inside it. It is not only, please understand my point. It is, please do not reduce me to the worst interpretation of this moment. And once that becomes the hidden agenda, the whole conversation changes. You are no longer just speaking from truth. You are negotiating with shame. You are trying to keep your self-respect alive by controlling the way it is reflected back to you. That is a terrible position to speak from, because it makes you easy to bend. Anyone who can threaten your identity can now start shaping your behavior. This is also why some misunderstandings feel almost unbearable, while others barely touch you. It is not always about closeness. It is often about what part of you the misunderstanding activates. If someone misreads your taste, your style, your preference, you may shrug. But if they misread your intention, your loyalty, your decency, your motives, something much older can wake up. Suddenly, you are not just in this conversation anymore. You're in every old moment where being seen wrongly had consequences. Every time you were blamed unfairly. Every time your motives were twisted. Every time love, approval, or safety felt tied to staying legible in someone else's eyes. That is why the reaction can feel bigger than the moment. The present exchange touches an old bruise, and now your words are trying to do more than clarify the present. They are trying to repair the past. That is where many people lose themselves, because once an old wound enters the room, the amount of language you produce can become wildly disproportionate to what is actually happening. A partner says, "You've changed." A parent says, "You think you're too good for us now." A colleague says, "I was just surprised you handled it that way." And before you know it, you are no longer answering the sentence. You are answering the ache underneath it. You are trying to prove all at once that you are still loyal, still decent, still respectful, still safe to love. At that point, the explanation may sound mature on the surface, but inside it is often a child trying not to be condemned. And this is why not every misunderstanding deserves correction. That truth sounds harsh until you understand what the alternative costs. If you try to correct every false impression, every unfair reading, every distorted reaction, your life becomes one long attempt to stabilize yourself through other people's perceptions. You never get to stand fully inside your own reality because part of you is always leaning outward, asking, "Did I fix it? Did they get it now? Do they see me correctly yet?" That is not peace. That is dependence wearing the clothes of conscientiousness. Sometimes the strongest move is to let the misunderstanding sit there, not because truth does not matter, not because reputation is irrelevant, but because not every distortion is available for honest repair. Some people do not misunderstand you accidentally. They misunderstand you in the exact direction their needs require. They need you selfish so they can stay innocent. They need you cold so they can stay entitled. They need you cruel so they do not have to face what your boundary says about them. In those moments, more explanation does not bring clarity. It only feeds a structure that was never built to receive truth in good faith. You see this especially clearly in the kind of conversations that never seem to end. You explain. They nod, but not really. Then they return with a new angle, a new hurt, a new objection, a new sadness that somehow keeps the original guilt alive. You answer that too. For a moment it seems calmer. Then something else appears, another twist, another, "I just feel like," another, "That may be true, but..." And slowly you realize you are not in a conversation anymore. You are in an emotional treadmill. You are spending language, energy, and self-respect to reach a finish line that keeps moving. At some point, maturity requires the ability to see that and stop. To say, in whatever form fits the situation, "I have clarified this enough. I do not need to keep defending a truthful decision just because someone wants the emotional cost of it removed." That is a major shift, because now you are no longer making your dignity available for negotiation every time another person feels discomfort. You are no longer treating their dissatisfaction as proof that you failed to explain properly. You are beginning to see that sometimes the discomfort is the message. Sometimes the friction is not a sign that truth was spoken badly. It is a sign that truth landed where someone did not want it to land. And this is where self-respect starts becoming more solid, not when no one is upset with you, not when every difficult conversation ends with beautiful mutual understanding, but when you can survive being seen imperfectly without scrambling to rescue your image, when you can tolerate the fact that some people will leave with a version of you that is incomplete, uncharitable, or flat-out wrong, and still remain in contact with what is true. That takes strength, real strength, much more than eloquence takes, because the temptation to explain yourself is often really the temptation to run from that pain. The pain of not being able to govern another mind, the pain of being reduced, the pain of knowing that someone important may carry a version of you that feels unfair. Most people would rather keep talking than face that helplessness. But at a certain level of maturity, you begin to understand that helplessness is part of freedom. The price of being internally anchored is giving up the fantasy that you can make yourself unmisunderstandable to everyone who matters. That does not mean becoming careless about impact. It does not mean using "I don't owe anyone anything" as an excuse to become lazy, selfish, or cruel. Some conversations absolutely deserve care. Some harm absolutely deserves repair. Some misunderstandings are honest and should be clarified generously. But the mature person learns to separate those cases from the endless compulsion to explain their goodness every time another person feels disappointed. That compulsion does not make you kinder. Very often, it just makes you easier to control. So part of becoming stronger is learning to let your actions carry some of the meaning that your anxious mind keeps trying to force through language. If you are respectful over time, you do not need to prove your respect in every tense moment. If you are loving in your pattern, you do not need to perform innocence every time someone feels hurt by a boundary. If you are honest in your conduct, you can survive a scene in which someone chooses not to see that honesty clearly. This is where character becomes more powerful than explanation, not because words stop mattering, but because words are no longer being asked to carry the entire burden of your worth. And when that shift happens, a different kind of quiet enters you. Not coldness, not detachment in the dead sense, just less panic around being judged through one narrow moment. You stop trying to solve every emotional distortion with more language. You stop treating every disappointed reaction as an emergency. You begin to understand that sometimes preserving your self-respect means allowing the conversation to end before your explanation starts tearing pieces off your dignity in the name of being understood. There comes a point in adult life where saying less is no longer a communication tactic. It becomes a form of self-respect, not because silence is automatically noble, not because every quiet person is strong, but because if you have seen enough of these cycles, you start to recognize the moment when more words will not make the truth clearer. They will only make you smaller inside it. That moment matters. It is usually not dramatic. It can happen in a text thread, in a kitchen, in a meeting, in the middle of a tired conversation where you already know what is happening. You explain once, maybe twice. The point is clear. But the atmosphere stays tense, and now you feel the old pull to keep going, to soften more, to prove more, to make the other person comfortable enough that they release you from the pressure of being misread. That is the moment to notice, because from there, two different paths open. On one path, you keep speaking. You add one more paragraph, one more justification, one more emotional cushion around the truth. And for a few seconds, it can feel like relief. You feel active again. You feel like you are doing something, but underneath, the old pattern is still in charge. You are trying to purchase peace with extra language. You are trying to earn the right to stand by what was already valid before the explanation got longer. On the other path, you stop, not in anger, not as punishment, not as theater. You simply stop donating more of yourself to a moment that is no longer asking for truth in a clean way. This is where silence becomes strength. Not when it is cold, when it is disciplined, not when it is used to dominate, when it is used to protect what should not be dragged into endless negotiation. A lot of people misunderstand this point. They think silence means repression, distance, ego, avoidance. Sometimes it does. Sometimes silence is cowardice. Sometimes it is a shield used by immature people who cannot face a real conversation. But that is not the silence we are talking about here. We are talking about the silence that comes after clarity has already been given, after the truth has already been spoken, after the boundary has already been stated. The silence that says, "I will not keep explaining this just because you are unhappy that it is true." That kind of silence changes your life because it breaks a very old addiction, the addiction to managing perception. So much unnecessary suffering comes from trying to control the version of you that lives in other people's heads. You want to make sure they see the nuance, the good intention, the emotional context, the part of you that feels fair and decent and loving. And of course that desire is human. But it becomes corrosive when it starts governing your behavior. Because then your inner life is no longer anchored in what is true. It is anchored in what is being reflected back at you. The stronger move is harder. You tell the truth cleanly. You repair when repair is honestly needed. You clarify when clarification serves reality. And then you let other people have their reaction, their disappointment, their confusion, their temporary wrong version of you. You let them have the unfinished feeling without rushing in to complete it for them. That does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop making their internal process your permanent responsibility. This is where many people finally begin to understand the difference between explaining facts and explaining worth. Facts may need explanation. Timing may need explanation. Logistics may need explanation. Harm, when real harm has been done, may need explanation and repair, but your worth does not. Your right to have limits does not. Your right to disappoint someone without becoming immoral does not. Your right to choose, decline, pause, leave, or say no does not need to be defended into existence every time another person struggles with it. That distinction is everything, because once you fail to make it, your speech becomes contaminated. You start using explanation for two jobs at once. One is honest communication. The other is emotional self-defense. And when those two get mixed together, your language loses force. It starts sounding like a plea, even when the words themselves are reasonable. This is why some people speak very clearly and still sound weak, while others say far less and still sound deeply settled. The difference is not intelligence. It is whether they are using words to communicate reality or to beg reality to restore their position inside someone else's mind. A more grounded life begins when you stop doing that. You stop chasing the perfect interpretation. You stop treating every misunderstanding like a fire. You stop assuming that tension always means you now owe more explanation. Sometimes tension simply means the truth has landed in a place where another person does not want to carry it. That is not always your problem to solve. And this is where the identity shift finally happens. You become someone who can stay intact after saying enough, someone who can tell the truth without hovering over it, someone who can let a sentence stand on its own legs, someone who no longer feels compelled to rescue every interaction from ambiguity before resting. That kind of person feels different to others. Quieter, yes, but also heavier. More settled, harder to pull into emotional overwork, harder to trap with guilt, harder to manipulate through confusion, disappointment, or atmosphere alone. That is real authority, not loudness, not coldness, not the performance of not caring. Real authority is the ability to remain inwardly organized when another person is disorganized in their reading of you. It is the ability to let your conduct speak where your fear wants to over-explain. It is the ability to survive being seen partially without immediately abandoning yourself to correct the picture. And perhaps that is the deeper freedom hidden in all of this. You stop trying to be unmisunderstandable. You stop trying to make every difficult moment end in moral clearance. You stop explaining yourself as if clarity from others is what makes you legitimate. Instead, you become more loyal to something quieter and stronger. The truth of what you meant, the integrity of how you acted, and the discipline to stop when more words would only be feeding fear. Explain what needs to be explained, repair what needs to be repaired, speak when speaking serves truth. But do not keep explaining your value to people who are measuring you through the discomfort of not getting their way. At some point, maturity is exactly this, knowing when another sentence would help the situation, and knowing when another sentence would only teach the world that your dignity becomes negotiable under pressure. That is why the strongest presence in the room is often not the person with the longest defense. It is the person who knows where explanation ends, where self-respect begins, and how to let the silence after that do its work. You can see all of this more clearly when it leaves theory and enters ordinary life, not the dramatic moments, the small ones, the moments where most people lose their center so quietly they barely notice it happening. A manager sends a message late in the day asking if you can take on one more task before tomorrow. You already know the answer. You do not have the time, and if you say yes, you will pay for it somewhere else. So you write, "I can't take that on tonight, but I can look at it in the morning." That is clear. That is enough. But then the discomfort starts. What if that sounds unhelpful? What if it hurts your image? What if they think you are not committed? So, the second message begins forming in your head. Just to clarify, I've been slammed all day, and I stayed late twice this week, and I'm juggling a few other deadlines, and I just don't want this to come across like I'm not trying to help. That is the exact moment the old pattern tries to take over. Not when you say no, when you start trying to defend your right to say it. Or imagine a conversation at home. You tell a family member you will not be coming this weekend. You need rest. They go quiet. Then comes the line you have heard before. You've been distant lately. Now, two things are possible. You can answer the feeling underneath that sentence for the next 15 minutes, explaining your schedule, your stress, your intentions, your love, your reasons, your guilt. Or you can answer the truth of the moment more cleanly. I know it may feel that way. I still need the weekend to myself. That second version feels harder at first because it leaves some tension in the room, but it is often healthier because it does not convert a boundary into a plea for moral acquittal. The same thing happens in relationships. Someone asks, "Why didn't you reply?" The anxious version of you may want to rush in with context, reassurance, tone management, evidence that you care, evidence that you're not pulling away, evidence that nothing terrible is happening. And sometimes a little context is human and right, but sometimes the stronger answer is simply, "I needed some quiet." It wasn't about punishing you. Clear, kind, finished. The key is not becoming robotic. The key is noticing when the explanation has already done its job and refusing to keep talking just to make sure no discomfort remains anywhere. That is the practice, really, not becoming silent in some dramatic absolute sense, learning to detect the moment after enough. That moment is subtle. It is the point where another sentence would no longer add truth, only reduce your anxiety. Another sentence would no longer clarify the situation, only help you escape the feeling of being temporarily misread. If you can learn to catch that moment, you can start changing the habit where it actually lives. Sometimes the best training is almost physical. Say the sentence. Then stop moving toward your phone for a few seconds. Feel the urge to add more. Feel the pressure in the body that says, fix it, soften it, explain it better. Do not leave it like this. Stay there a moment instead of obeying it immediately. That pause matters because it teaches you something most people never learn. The urge to over-explain rises like a wave, but it does not have to become language. You can survive it. You can let it pass without turning it into 3 extra paragraphs. Another useful test is brutally simple. Ask yourself, am I explaining the situation, or am I explaining why I should still be seen as good while standing in this situation? Those are not the same thing. I can't come tonight may be the situation. Please understand that I am still caring, loyal, generous, and worthy, even though I can't come tonight is something else entirely. Once you hear that second layer, the whole pattern becomes easier to catch. And there is a quieter shift that happens when you stop feeding it. You begin to trust your own clean statements more. You stop assuming that every limit must arrive padded with enough emotional wrapping to be acceptable. You stop acting as though another person's first disappointed reaction is the final verdict on whether you handled something well. You become less available for those long, draining exchanges where the real issue is never the issue. That does not make you colder, it makes you more structurally calm. Over time, people feel that change. At work, you become clearer. In family dynamics, you become harder to pull into old guilt loops. In relationships, your words start carrying more weight because they are no longer crowded by nervous over-offering. And perhaps more importantly, you begin to feel different to yourself. Less scattered after hard conversations, less ashamed of having needs, less desperate to chase down every incorrect impression before you can rest. That is when you realize the deepest cost of over-explaining was never only how it made you sound, it was how it trained you to leave yourself every time tension appeared. It taught you to run toward the other person's perception before you had even remained faithful to your own position. And the opposite practice is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is simply the discipline of staying with yourself long enough to let truth remain whole. So when the moment comes, say what is true, say what is necessary, say it as cleanly as you can. Then watch carefully for the old impulse to keep going, not because reality needs more light, but because fear wants more protection. That is the turning point. Not every time, perhaps, not perfectly, but each time you refuse to explain your worth through excess language, something steadier gets built. In the end, people may still misunderstand you. Some will. Some will leave with an incomplete picture. Some will choose the version of you that best protects their comfort. Let that happen when it must. Your task is not to become impossible to misread. Your task is to become strong enough that being misread no longer automatically pulls you into self-abandonment. Explain the facts when the facts need explaining. Repair what truly needs repair. But do not keep offering pieces of your dignity to any conversation that demands more and more language, just to let you keep standing where you already have the right to stand. Real maturity begins there, in the clean sentence, in the tolerated silence after it, in the decision to let your truth remain whole, even when someone else does not know what to do with it.